Welcome to today's program, Kosher Nostra, the life and times of Jewish gangsters in the United States. My name is Gabriel Sanders, and I'm the public programs producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 25th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you for joining us today virtually. We hope you will visit the museum in person to see our new core exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, alongside our temporary exhibition, Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, photographs by Martin Scholler. You can learn more and find tickets on our website. We appreciate the vital support of our members here at the museum. If you want to get closer to the museum and enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission, you can explore museum membership on our website or email membership@mjhnyc.org to learn more. Closed captions are available on today's program. Instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat, in addition to the links I've mentioned. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. One upcoming event I would like to just mention before we start, we're hosting the New York Jewish Book Festival with an opening event on Thursday. It's a screening of the first episode of Fleischman is in Trouble and a conversation with Taffy Brodesser-Ackner and A.O. Scott. The full festival is on Sunday, December 11th. We have 32 events at the museum, and for those joining us virtually, 7 of those keynotes will be live streamed from our Edmund J. Safra Hall. You can find the full program at nyjewishbookfestival.org. Today, we're honored to be joined by Robert Rockaway, Joe Kraus, and Geoff Schumacher. Robert Rockaway is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University. He has authored The Jews of Detroit from the Beginning, 1760 to 1914, Words of the Uprooted, Jewish Immigrants in the Early 20th Century America, and But He Was Good to His Mother, The Lives and Crimes of Jewish Gangsters. Rockaway has been a visiting professor at Brandeis University, Boston University, San Diego State University, and George Washington University, as well as a visiting scholar and guest lecturer in numerous cities worldwide. He has appeared on radio and television in Israel and the United States. Joe Kraus is professor and chair of the Department of English and Theater at the University of Scranton, where he teaches creative writing and American literature. He is the author of The Kosher Capones and co-author of An Accidental Anarchist. His academic and creative work has appeared, among other places, in the American Scholar, Baltimore Review, River Teeth Moment, Southern Humanities Review, and Under the Sun. He is a 2-time Pushcart nominee and past president of MELUS. Geoff Schumacher, vice president of exhibits and programs for the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, is the author of 2 books, Sun, Sin, and Suburbia, A History of Modern Las Vegas, and Howard Hughes, Power, Paranoia, and Palace Intrigue. He started his 25-year journalism career at the Las Vegas Sun, served as director of community publications for the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and wrote a public affairs column for the Review-Journal. He has been interviewed as a subject matter expert for newspapers, magazines, documentaries, television shows, and podcasts. Thank you all for joining us today. I know it'll be an interesting and lively conversation. I will hand things over to Geoff.
Thank you, Gabriel. Appreciate it. I want to say hello to you, Joe, and Bob. I'm coming to you from Las Vegas, so it's the morning here. It's afternoon in many parts, and it's evening where Bob is. So welcome to everyone on the panel, as well as everybody out viewing this program from all over. I thought we would start when we talk about the life and times of Jewish gangsters in the United States, how this all sort of started, right? And it started with immigration to the United States and with the arrival of primarily, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe and coming into the cities of America. I wonder, Robert, if you could maybe start by giving us just a little bit of that background on the sort of the arrival of Jews in America and the sort of emergence of organized crime within that community.
Be happy to. Look, first, there were Jewish criminals in the 19th century. It's not a new phenomenon in the United States, but the huge immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe, beginning in the 1880s and carrying through to World War I, where it stopped because of the war, and then it continued for a few years until 1920. So, but most of the Jews who came at that period were from Eastern Europe. They came either as children or they were born in the United States. I mean, the image of the Jews coming as criminals, they weren't criminals when they came, and they were not part of any criminal families. The phenomena of the Jewish mobsters, it was really an American phenomena because they learned the business in the United States. And the big push became during Prohibition. Americans wanted to drink. And in the brilliance of the United States government's attitudes, they passed a law making it illegal to buy and sell and manufacture liquor of any kind. Well, what did Al Capone say? You can't stop a thirst by legislating against it. And people wanted to drink, and Jews became involved. They had been involved in Europe and in Poland and in other places in the liquor business, and they had ale houses and other places where they sold liquor. So it's not a unique phenomenon for them, but it opened the door during Prohibition for tough children of immigrants growing up on the streets of New York or Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore, Boston, and other places to enter into the business and make lots of money, which they did. And they and the Italians, Jews and the Italians, were the two ethnic groups that really created organized crime in the United States from coast to coast. There were others, sure, the Irish were there were some Poles, but basically it was the two largest ethnic groups were the Jews and the Italians.
Joe, if you can sort of elaborate on that, I'm interested in sort of why did this happen? In other words, when you come to the United States, the overwhelming majority of immigrants said, I'm going to work hard. I'm going to just, I'm going to pay my dues, and maybe the next generation will do better, and the next generation will do better after that. There were some, as we say at the museum, people that took a shortcut to the American dream, right? And that was kind of what we're talking about today.
You want me to answer, or go ahead?
Oh, that's for Joe. Yep.
Oh, go ahead.
Just for starters, I want to thank everybody. It's a privilege to be here. We have a very large webinar audience, and I'm really flattered to be here with Robert, Bob, whose work I've known for many years, and Geoff. It's great to be meeting you, and I know the fabulous work you do at the Mob Museum. I mean, Bob, you said it really eloquently. That's the nature of sort of the central strand of organized crime is through Prohibition and through the Jews and the Italians and that function. I would suggest there are some consequential organized Jewish crime forces that take place even earlier, less through alcohol and more through gambling and sadly through prostitution. So there are other organized components that were present in the Jewish community and other ethnic communities that did sort of breed organized crime. Prohibition was so vast that it subsumed a lot of them. I mean, the Capone organization in Chicago really begins as primarily a prostitution ring, and then develops other things. Some of the Chicago Jews really come out of the gambling world, but Prohibition changes everything, as you said. I think to answer your other question, Geoff, about where this emerges, out of immigration, to be an immigrant is to be lonely and to be vulnerable. And so what happens is you form many self-supporting communities. We've got Landsmannschaften, which are legitimate organizations. You get burial societies, which are ways of working cooperatively as immigrants in this new space. And you have less formal versions of that. You have street gangs. You have tough groups. And as a consequence, in the tough groups, in the underworld, almost in a literal sense at times, if you're talking subway kind of experiences, we're talking underneath railroad tracks, underneath L tracks. You have these groups that essentially fight their way into greater security in the face of that vulnerability. And when you have that greater security, when you have a kind of physicality, that's when the other things follow. If you're the toughest guys on the block and there's money to be made selling booze and running gambling, you do it. And that's one of the stages in development of the more sophisticated organized crime that Bob was talking about.
Absolutely. And it tended to happen. I mean, we're certainly, we can jump around the United States and talk about different individuals in different cities, but New York was obviously a big place for Jewish organized crime. Certainly Lower East Side, and some of these early gangsters, became quite infamous, right? You had Monk Eastman, who may or may not have been Jewish, right? And then Jack Zelig, and of course nobody can really rival Arnold Rothstein. Robert, do you want to talk a little bit about who he was and sort of how he was handling organized crime?
Sure. Arnold Rothstein was not a bootlegger. He was not really a criminal. He was primarily a gambler, and he had enough money. Look, Americans like to gamble. Let's not kid ourselves. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants were involved in stuff and everything. Americans wanted to gamble, and Rothstein would provide them with these things if he could. But he also accumulated a large amount of money and was clever enough to hire to work for him tough, streetwise young men, Italians and Jews, to do some of the dirty work, to go out and do what they had to do. He also sent abroad, especially a man by the name of Jascha Katzenberg, a very Italian-sounded name, to England, and he was bringing over liquor from England to the United States, and then it landed in New York, and they distributed it. But Rothstein realized quickly that the business was too big for him to control. Others were getting involved. There was no way that he could control everything. The United States is a huge country, as you all know, hundreds of millions of people. And so he just got out of it in a way, but was active, at least in New York and a few other places. But he was active in the sense that he brought into the business some men who became prominent, like Lepke Buchalter and Meyer Lansky and others who became involved and were involved in controlling it together with the Italians. Look, Detroit, Michigan, for God's sakes, how many Jews were in Detroit? All right, 70,000. Why? How was crime controlled in that city by the Jews? How did the Jews control crime in Newark, New Jersey? How did they control crime in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where there were only 20,000 Jews? They were well organized, and they knew what they wanted to do, and they got involved in all of this business. So you had to, I'm not blaming Jews, that's a great thing to use anti-Semitism. Well, the Jews did it all. No, there were others involved, but you had the Jews who had we'll say throughout the United States, they were linked together by ethnic identity and even family identity, as well as the Italians were linked together ethnically. And so they were connected from one place to the other place, and money was to be made. But I will say one thing, it was one generational with the Jews. The children of immigrants did it, and then they got out of it. They sent their kids, as all good Jewish parents did, to universities and other things, and became doctors and lawyers. So when you look at it, you really see that it was basically one generational, the era of Prohibition. And when that was over, it continued into the 30s with narcotics and things. But when Italy was an ally of Nazi Germany, and when Germany started killing its Jews, they killed gangsters and criminals along with doctors and lawyers and others. And so then the Italians, who were allies of Germany, continued in the business, and they continued to be prominent and were able to bring over to the United States these things where the Jews were already out of it. There were not too many European Jews around at the time to be involved in it. But the Jews were, heavily involved during Prohibition. Other groups were involved as well. And it's the old story. Americans wanted to drink, and the United States government didn't want them to drink. Well, good luck. It's like passing a law against smoking everywhere. People want to smoke. They're going to smoke. I don't smoke, and I think it's bad for you, but what the heck? I'm not going to be moralistic about that in terms of it. So, but the Jews were involved, but it was one generation. They didn't have any descendants. The Italians kept it in the family. When they talked about a family business, it was the father, the children, maybe even the grandchildren. The Jews, it was one generational with them, and then that was it. They were out of it after that one generation. The children of immigrants, and then it didn't continue with the Jews.
Thank you, Bob. Joe, so one of your specialties is Chicago and Jewish organized crime in Chicago. Can you talk about how that was a little bit different? And you don't hear these sort of famous names coming out of Chicago on the Jewish side anyway.
Yeah, well, so I think it's funny. I sometimes have to translate for a New York-centered understanding of the world. But if the neighborhood equivalent of the Lower East Side of Chicago was Maxwell Street, the Near East Side, and just as the immigrant pattern in New York was to move from the Lower East Side into the Brooklyn and Bronx, primarily Brooklyn in terms of organized crime, at least was most notorious out of Brooklyn. In Chicago, they moved from this Maxwell Street neighborhood further west to what's called Lawndale. And Lawndale is the most substantial Jewish community that Chicago ever has, and it's really the center of everything. And that's where the gangsters, in particular, that I explore emerged. And I think Robert is very much right in the respect that that's a one generation phenomenon, certainly in Lawndale. One of the crucial differences in Chicago is, and New York is sort of famous for having created this what they call the five family structure. I think there are ways of interrogating that. I'm not sure it's always as neat as it's presented, but certainly that's the standard understanding of how organized crime worked in New York rather. It came under the auspices entirely of an Italian American organization, and increasingly not just Italian American, but Sicilian American, gradually moving into sort of taking shape in New York. In Chicago, it plays out somewhat differently. For one thing, there is a dominant organization. Rather than five that are yoked together in competition, in Chicago, a single organization emerges. And what's more, if New York's is eventually sort of overseen by Lucky Luciano, who is a Sicilian American, in Chicago, Capone is not a Sicilian. He's from southern parts of Italy, but not Sicily. So that creates a different structure. Now, people who tend to start with the New York vision just assume that the Chicago world is one more family that function within this larger association of Italian American or Sicilian American families, and that's in many ways true. But it's got a different structure and a different function. So within that, there are many consequential Jewish figures who remain into another generation as central figures in the Chicago mob. The most famous is a guy named Jack Guzik, often called Greasy Thumb. It's another one of those nicknames that gets assigned back and forth. And we've kicked that back and forth. There are a lot of details. I promise not to bore everybody with it, though I certainly can. But in terms of contrast, I do think it's useful to remember that those are different experiences. If we look only at New York as for how these things emerged, I don't think we get the full nuances of how the variety of possibilities of Jewish organized crime.
Thank you. So, Bob, you are originally from Detroit, from Michigan, right. And so this is one of your areas of great focus. Can you talk about the Purple Gang? Really a pretty amazing little phenomenon, how powerful they were for a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, they became powerful. They all came from the same neighborhood. Detroit also had its east side. And they came from the east side. They went to school together, at least elementary school. One thing about these gangsters, I should mention, very few of them finished high school. And it's the old story. If you want to have the good life, beautiful girlfriends, fancy house, fancy cars, but you're uneducated, you don't want to stand on your feet in some shop or something. That was for jerks. I mean, they had other words for it, but they didn't want. How do you get the money? How do you make the money? If you're a tough person and don't have that kind of morality that would stop you from doing it, you got involved in criminal activities, and it paid off. Americans wanted to drink, they wanted to do this, and you provided them with these services. Now, I interviewed old-time officers. They're all dead now, the ones I interviewed, including including Meyer Lansky. And a number of them said basically the same thing, although they didn't know each other. They said the same thing. They wanted certain things, and we provided them with their entertainment, whether it was the liquor, the booze, the women, whatever it was, narcotics. It used to be that Jews weren't involved in narcotics. Give me a break. Arnold Rothstein was one of the first people that started bringing over narcotics from Europe to the United States. There's a lot of myths around, and a lot of the ethnic groups are very upset when you talk about it. You can't imagine, and it's not a reflection on anything, the heat that I got, and I didn't ignore it. I said, what are you going to do, send a hitman to kill me in Israel or something? Where I started writing about this, and I began to write about it in the 70s, because I read an article in 1977 in a Jewish journal yet, which talked about the fact, hey, look, how come no one is talking about these Jewish criminals, these gangsters? We had them. Why? And I know why. It's because, first of all, the Jews had a concept of shame. They did not want to shame the family. The mobsters that I interviewed, none of them said they were sorry for what they did, but all of them, and there were more than one or two or three, and 10, 15, 20 of them said that they were sorry that it shamed the family. There was no real glory for the family if your son is a bootlegger or a criminal. I mean, there wasn't. And that, all of them said the same thing, but I was ashamed. I was sorry that it did bring shame on my family. But listen, if you wanted to make a living and you were tough and you were not afraid of the police, who you bribed, and the judges were bribed and others, then you got involved in criminal activities, and it was lucrative. I mean, for many of them, not all of them. Some were killed in the gang wars, others went to jail. The Purple Gang, half of them ended up dead because they were killed off by the Sicilians in Detroit. The other half went to jail. I mean, it was a rough business. But one man said to me, if you're not willing to use violence or to accept violence, and he was involved in this, he said, don't get involved. But if you're willing to use violence, and you're going to have to use violence, and you're willing or you understand that you're going to have to take violent actions against you, if you're not willing to do that, then don't get involved. But if you're able to take that or to experience it or willing to do it, then you could do it. And for a long period of time, or at least through the 20s and so, and look, crime in Detroit was controlled by the Purple Gang. Newark, New Jersey was controlled by Abner Zwillman and his Jewish syndicate. So you have that Minneapolis, Minnesota, Davy Berman, who was Jewish and controlling crime in a city that had only 20,000 Jews. So you go from place to place. If you were willing to be involved and to use violence to achieve your ends, you could succeed. I mean, if people look at me and say, would you have been willing to do it? I said, I don't know. I mean, I was always an athlete. I love playing ball, but I don't know if shooting someone goes along with what I mean, I've had to shoot in various instances in my life, but basically, would I be willing to do that? Would I be willing to shame my family? Or would I take the risk of if I was married and had children, that my family would somehow be in danger? No, I don't think I would do that. But these men were willing to do it. And for a period of time, they were successful. When you look at city by city, at least on the East Coast, you take, New York or Newark or Minneapolis, Minnesota, Detroit, Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio, which isn't on the East Coast by any means, but it's considered East. These places were controlled by Jewish syndicates during Prohibition. How does that happen? Where they're not the majority of the population. So there's one Italian that I interviewed many years ago. He said, the Italians, and then he used the negative term, the damn wops, or something like that. He said to me, he said they wanted to make money from you today and not make all the money today. He says the Jews were businessmen. They wanted to make a buck with you today and a buck from you tomorrow and a buck with you the next day. So they were more organized, more business oriented. That isn't that the Italians weren't, but the Jews were more business oriented. There's a reason for Las Vegas. Italians became heavily involved, and who were managing the casinos? Jews. Jews were managing it because they were very good in the business aspect of it.
I want to come back to Las Vegas, but before we do that, Joe, I think it might be worth sort of digging in a little bit to the different organizational tendencies of the Italian American mafia versus the Jewish syndicates, because the Italian, as we all know from the movies and from reality, they had and still have a very sort of, detailed, family kind of organization. And I think it was a little different with the Jewish syndicates.
Yeah, if I could real quickly jump into the Detroit Purple Gang thing. One thing that makes the Purple Gang so striking is Detroit is a port city. And of course, it's useful to remember then that much of what gave them particular consequence was that they were able to bring booze in from Canada.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Chicago, my own Chicago gangster family relatives, that's really what they were able to accomplish, was to bring in the from Detroit to Chicago then. So that's what distinguishes them there.
Yeah. Because it was legal in Canada. It was legal.
Yeah.
They said, hey, we don't care. They want to buy the liquor from us, we'll sell it to them. And they did. I mean, it wasn't illegal. Canada did have a previous to that laws against, prohibition and all this kind of stuff. But when that law was erased, they were willing to say, oh, give their money to anybody. And they had, in Detroit, across the Detroit River, what they called the Little Jewish Navy, that the ships were operated by Jews who would buy this stuff in Canada, bring it over to Detroit, and then they distribute it into Ohio, Kentucky, and other places as well. It was a big operation. And you say, well, how come? Because Americans wanted to drink. And they provided, as many of these men I interviewed who are now long gone, they provided the service because the government prohibited it. But if you want to have a drink and there's a law that says you can't drink, you're going to find a way to get something to drink. And if it's illegal, if you have to pay someone who's bringing it illegally, you'll pay him. You can justify it by saying, hey, the government is opposed to this, but I'm not working for the government. I want to drink. So you had that, and they provided a service. So many of them said, what are they trying to, Al Capone said it all the time, I don't know why they want to put me in jail. I provide a service. He said, some of my best customers are these judges. They keep trying to put them in jail. So what can I tell you? There's the real world and the mythical world, and the real world is somehow different than the idealistic utopian world we would like to have it be. I mean, one thing I will say, Jews did not become addicted to the liquor. They always drank Saturday night, Friday night, the Sabbath meal, wine at the meal. All the Jewish holidays have wine involved in them, but the level of drunkenness amongst the Jews was very, very low compared to other. I mean, there was, but very low, very low.
Joe, I want to give you a chance to go back to the microphone.
Sure. So Geoff, thank you. I am a historian, but I'm really by training, I'm a literary scholar. And so what always strikes me is the way we tell the story about the history, history, it's HI story, right? So what's the story that we use, the lens that we use as we try to make sense of this historical phenomenon? And so there's an interesting overlay at this point. We all think we know what the gangster looks like, right? Al Capone is the most famous gangster, Lucky Luciano. We all think we know what the gangster looks like, and he is, by convention in that narrative, Italian and involved in a certain way as part of a larger structure. If you've seen The Godfather, it's a family structure, right? There's the boss, there's the underboss, the capos, the soldiers. It's a very large structure. So because the story of the Italian gangster is so well told and repeatedly told, we see a single Italian gangster and he stands in for an entire network of gangster figures. The Jews had organizations like that. The Meyer Lansky organization is pretty substantial. We know it goes in a lot of different directions. But the story we tell doesn't encompass that in the same way. And the Jewish experience is also more complicated, as Bob was saying. It often ventured into control of illegal businesses, which is also true of the Italian organized crime. It's just not a part of the story that we typically tell. So for me, the crucial difference is that we don't see Jewish organized crime in the same way we see Italian organized crime, because we think of all organized crime as Italian organized crime. So again, I don't want to go too far off, but the nature of Jewish organized crime is harder to pick up at times because of the way we tell that story.
We know that according to the statistics, and there are statistics from the FBI, I have lists of these guys from the FBI, and the FBI got it from local government, local police forces, and the stuff's available. that 50% of the major bootleggers in the United States during Prohibition were Jews. And you say, what Jews doing these kinds of things? You know? I mean, it's so against the Jewish narrative of the doctor and the lawyer and the scholar and all that stuff. But that's just the fact of life. And look, when I started doing this and writing about it, you can't imagine the heat that I got. And I ignored it. I mean, they didn't threaten my life or anything. But the argument always was, you're going to cause anti-Semitism. Why do you want to do this? Why do you want to bring it up? And look, I'm writing about things that happened in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And these people were getting me, this was in the 70s, they started getting after me. And I said, why are you so afraid of portraying the real experiences of Jews in the United States and ignoring this whole section of them being involved in criminal activities or bootlegging or whatever it is? It's like to ignore that and only talk about the Jewish doctors and musicians and artists and all that stuff. And part of it was the deep-seated Jewish fear, especially when they looked at Europe during the 1930s. Who was running around in Europe? And then Adolf Hitler, and then who did you have? Mussolini in Italy. The Jews were terrified in the United States that what happened in Europe could happen to them because their parents were all from Europe and they were descendant from European Jews. And they were not that secure as Americans who kind of ignore that. They were still nervous that what happens in Europe or happens in Europe can happen in the United States. And when I was approached not to write about this, I wasn't threatened physically or anything like that, but the plea was, you're going to cause anti-Semitism. Why are you doing this? And I said, well, it's part of our history. And I'm a historian. I mean, why would I want to just write about the great leaders, for God's sakes? Not every Jew is a great leader, but this was fascinating to me. This whole aspect of prohibition and bootlegging and underworld activities. I mean, I really have to say I enjoyed it. To me, I always wrote about immigrants. I always wrote about history from the bottom up, not from the top down. To me, it was interesting. What's going on with the average man, with the average person, with the family? What are they doing? What are they functioning as? But I'm sorry. I'm just, go ahead.
No, that's good. We're just so everybody knows, we're getting some really great questions from the audience, which we'll address here very soon. I want to be sure one of them is included. I want us to talk just for a few minutes about, really how the Jewish gangsters got involved in really fighting the Nazis, essentially, in the United States, and especially the Bund and all that. Who would like to start to sort of give us an overview of that?
Well, I'm not boasting. I'm not modern. I mean, there are people who are better historians than me, everything, but I was one of the first people that started writing about or examining Jewish activities against the Nazi Bund in the United States. Now you say, why? Well, because these gangsters, these underworld, they were tough guys. And when they saw what was going on, in the United States, I mean, most Americans don't even know this. You people know it, you're historians and stuff. There were these demonstrations and the marching around Madison Square Garden and everything with the Nazi flags and the Nazi salute. Jews were not, these men were not going to tolerate these kinds of attacks, verbally and other ways, against the Jews in the United States, considering what was going on in Europe, where what did the Jews do in Europe? Well, they didn't organize the way the ones in America did. They were terrified. I mean, and so they took actions against these people, direct actions, and not just talk. They did it physically. They beat the stuffings out of these guys in these anti-Semitic meetings. And I talked to enough people who were involved. And one of them, Max Hinkes from Newark, New Jersey, and he told me what they did. He says, we knew that there was a meeting of these Nazis, these pro-Nazis in Newark, New Jersey. He says, we went to the hall and we threw stink bombs into the meeting, and they came running out. And we were on both sides of the street, with baseball bats and iron bars. And when they came running out, we started whacking them in the head and all these other exposed parts of their body. This was a generation of Jews that were not afraid to use physical violence against people who attacked them verbally and in other ways. That changed over time. We know that. Would they do that today? I don't think so. Well, I live in Israel. We react differently to these kinds of things. But would American Jews be willing to take violent action? Would they start beating up people who attack them verbally? And I don't think so. They're respectable and they're not involved in this kind of stuff. But they did in the if you look at the 1930s, wow. I mean, and I talked to people who were involved in it. And then one of them said to me, says, it's too bad we didn't kill the son of a bitches. We killed them, but we didn't. We just beat them up. We just broke their heads, broke their arms, broke their legs. And Meyer Lansky, too. I mean, he was approached by a judge, a Jewish judge, Nathan Perlman, who called him up and said, Meyer, and Lansky told me this. And then later on, I read about it in other ways, and I wrote about it in some ways, where he called him up and he said, Meyer, I think that Jews should be a little more activist, militant against these people who are attacking Jews. And Lansky said to me what he said to him. He said, all right, I will take care of it on one condition. He said, what? That the Jewish newspapers don't attack me for being a gangster. He said, I will organize it. And he did. And guess what? The newspapers attacked them. They said, we're respectable. These are Jewish gangsters. They're mobsters. They're not part of the community. So on the one hand, they want that action taken. On the other hand, they were fearful that the action would create anti-Semitism, which would affect a larger Jewish community. So you have that mixture.
Yeah. Well, I'll start by bragging. Bob is the one who did write the book about this, right? That's where.
Be nice.
Well, I mean, it's certainly where I learned a lot of it from your book, and perhaps you don't recall, but even conversations when you were writing your book. The title, of course, is classic, but he was good to his mother. Just the wonderful way that sums up this notion that there really is a kind of self-defense movement to it. At the time, I've been doing a fair bit of research myself. Even this is already the mid to late 80s.
Right.
And I needed to be persuaded by your thesis. I thought that's too good to be true. And even within my own family, and I did see there was a question. My own family were gamblers primarily, bootleggers on the West Side. It's the Davy Miller family, Bob. I think you might recall.
Oh, that's all. You've got a lot of yichus, as they say.
I do. Yeah. My grandfather was Davy's younger brother, and
wow.
The context of the Chicago movement. This is Geoff and I were talking about this a little bit. This is Prohibition, which obviously is pre-Nazi kind of moments.
Right.
But as I mentioned at the beginning, when you have an immigrant community that is aware of itself as vulnerable, it needs to find mutual aid of some sort, and much of the mutual aid takes place at the street level. So how do you defend yourself if you're the mother pushing a child across the street in a stroller? And suddenly a big tough guy in Chicago was disproportionately, the violence was often against Poles, because there's a substantial Polish community in neighbor that was bordering where Jewish communities were. Could have been any number of places. And you had violence to that point. It was often the young men who were involved in organized crime, and Davy Miller was slightly older than them, but his acolytes, the people who spent time at his gambling hall, spent time at his bar restaurant, and there are other 3 or 4 crucial Chicago-centered places where these people would gather. It was literally a Jewish self-defense association, and you would call. There were phone calls. You'd call Davy Miller's place and say, "Hey, someone's getting beat up over in Peterson Park," and they would drive up there to kind of defend. So I think that's the organized crime is not as well organized in that moment. What you were talking about, Bob, by the time of the Bundists that are marching, you've got far more substantially organized groups. And so you have the kinds of things. There's been some terrific work, I believe, since your book, but your book outlined much of it in New Jersey. Zwillman was very interesting in this experience. I know you talked about Mickey Cohen out in LA being involved in certain ways. So yeah, it's a sort of striking presence. However much these are people we're not going to like, these gangsters, and I always want to be careful not to valorize them. They're serial killers in many instances. Certainly the murdering guys we may or may not get a chance to talk to, but at that moment when it really was beginning to be an existential question, they were on our side, and they were doing a lot of this beating up. And so you have some really colorful stories of the kind you described, where the Jewish gangsters are literally attacking the Bundists. And certainly in Chicago, there were neighborhoods not far. I mean, I lived in one of the German neighborhoods many decades later, and there were still sort of lingering stories about how the Buddhists had learned to keep a somewhat low profile because it was not popular because it was going against the sentiments of the larger nation, but it was also not safe. And it was not safe because of this organized resistance, which took place among, from organized crime, but also in the shadow of organized crime, other young, tough people who may not have been criminals, but were affiliated, the pool hall kinds of kids.
Sure.
The
That
sharpers.
happened, that happened in Detroit and other places as well, where I spoke to Meyer Lansky about it. And he said when they were starting to take action against these Nazis, American Nazis, he said, we had a lot of young people who came to us, approached us, and they wanted to get involved, young Jews. And we taught them how to use their fists and how to fight and do things, because a lot of the Jews didn't know about it. Not everybody was a prize fighter, although most of the world champions in boxing in the 20s and 30s, and contenders and world champions were Jewish. It's interesting, that period of time. There were tough Jews, and they were, that immigrant generation, or the children of immigrants. You had to use your fists frequently in your neighborhood because you were attacked by the Poles or the Irish or whoever around. The ethnic groups did not always get along. It's not 2022 where everybody gets along, everybody is nice, ecumenical, and all the Catholics and Jews love each other, holding hands on Christmas and all that. No. The neighborhoods were just filled with that. And I remember even as a kid in Detroit, and this was back in I'm giving away my age, but in the 40s and 50s, that there were things going on, and we got involved. I was a kid. I mean, what could I do? I mean, I was 8 or 9, 10 years old or something like that. But I was attacked on the streets a lot of times for being, heard sheeny, kike, and wham, wham, wham. And I ended up having to learn how to use my fists more than I ordinarily would have had to, just to protect myself. Not that I'm going to go out and beat anybody up, but you get tired of getting beat up yourself. And so you learn how to fight. I've talked to others who said they went to the YMCA to learn how to box or something because they had to protect themselves. And once they learned how to box and gave back what they were getting, then it stopped. They knew that if you attacked these Jewish kids, they're going to fight back. And, you would get a broken tooth or a broken nose, and you didn't want to do that. So that stopped. But it was just a period where you had to use violence, unfortunately, in many areas. And you learned how to do so to protect yourself. So,
We have
the fact of life.
There's so much great material when you talk about the history of Jewish gangsters. We're not going to be able to get to everything, but I thought maybe I would ask you guys a few of the questions that have come in from the audience, because I think
Sure.
give us a nice diversity of subject matter. So one of our viewers asks or notes that in your book, Bob, But He Was Good to His Mother, the author, you stressed that Jews tried to hide from their wives and families that they were criminals. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the reason they did that, and they did, is that they realized that it was not a credible profession and it would bring shame to the family. So to protect the family, you did what you could to hide it or avoid the issue. And they tried very hard to do so because of this image of trying to protect the family from shame. Look, the Jews were a minority, and it's not like they were well loved in the United States by everyone at the time. They weren't. And they were very much aware of it. There was anti-Semitism in Detroit, the center of it. Henry Ford in the 1920s, the Catholic priest Charles Coughlin in the 1930s. I mean, these were really public anti-Semites and publicly speaking about the hatred for the Jews. And so the Jews were very much aware of it. And these gangsters, though, did whatever they could to protect the community. That doesn't mean they didn't beat up Jews when they were starting in their careers, kids, as teenagers. I mean, they didn't go out of their neighborhood into the Italian neighborhood to rob people. No. They robbed those. If they grew up in a Jewish area, they robbed Jews in the area because that was their area and they knew the streets and the places to hide and things. But they saw that I spoke to so many of them. They began to see that part of their how would I say, persona, or part of what they had to do was to help protect the Jewish people. That doesn't mean, as I said, when they were, years before, they weren't beating up Jews to do things, but they felt that part of their job was to protect the Jewish community from attacks from others. And there were these attacks, there were ethnic fights all the time. Poles, Irish, Jews clobbering each other in the neighborhoods. I remember as a kid, I grew up in Detroit, and for a period of time, one of the neighbors, Italian neighbors, sent her sons to walk with me to school because she knew that there were people in the neighborhood who were looking to beat up Jews. And so she sent this Italian woman, sent her Italian sons to protect this Jewish boy who's walking to school in the neighborhood. And I appreciated it. They didn't make a big issue of it. They just walked with me, and they prevented me from being attacked. So you had this mixture. We talk about it today. We don't have at least well, look, I live in Israel. I've been here for 50 years, over 50 years. But when I look at the United States, you don't have, I don't think, the ethnic neighborhoods the way they once did. I mean, you have Black neighborhoods and Puerto Rican areas and things like that. But with relationship to the Jews, they're spread out. I mean, there are Jewish areas, and generally Jews gravitate to Jewish areas because the schools have a reputation of being better. And if they need to keep kosher, ritually correct food, they go to the neighborhoods. And so, but it was very different way back when, as you're all aware, as historians, back in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s even, it was very different. It's not 2022, that's for sure.
Joe, I'll give you a chance to talk maybe a little bit about that. And we have a couple of questions that really deal with sort of family life and something that we talked about at the very beginning here, which is this is kind of a one generation phenomenon, which is a little different from Italian American, for example, so it's much more deeply rooted, it seems like, in their culture.
Sorry.
It's sort of a very weird question. This whole one generation phenomenon where people were moving on, and Bob's talked about this sense of shame, so they didn't talk to they tried to hide it from their families.
Okay, yeah.
Have you seen that in your own research?
Well, yeah, actually, there's one of the terrific books about the Jewish gangster is by a woman named Jenna Weissman Josselit called Our Gang, and what she does really beautifully is trace the degree to which the organized Jewish community has always been obscuring the larger question of Jewish organized crime. It's an erasure that goes back to the time it was taking place in the 20s, because Jews felt vulnerable, and they felt vulnerable if they were seen as a criminal organization. And I mean, Bob points out, it's not the immigrants, it's the children of the immigrants, right? It's the immigrants themselves are very law-abiding. And so Jonathan Sarna, the wonderful American Jewish historian, points out that in some ways the great phenomenon of the Jewish American experience is that when you have this vast influx of Eastern European Jews, the existing largely German Jewish population recognize them as part of one larger community. When you might have had a split, you might have had a schism, and they were invested. You talked about Judge Perlman. There are many leaders of the Jewish community, organized, wealthy Jewish community, who saw that they would at the very least they would be tarred with the crimes of the other Jews. So you had from the very beginning the organized Jewish community resisting the narrative that we're all a bunch of criminals. The Italians never had that. That's one of the crucial differences. In other words, we just had better PR from day one. So there's a part of that. Another, I think, more historical element of all of this, and I pay more attention to this in the Chicago context and generalize from there. Most people start in New York and look elsewhere, but it's also true that organized crime doesn't involve that many people at the top. Who's it eventually comes to the top? And so what happens in every instance eventually is that it's the Italians who come out on top. It's in many cases it's a small handful, but that makes it possible for other Italians to rise more readily than for Jews. As I say, in Chicago, it doesn't function quite the same way. And there are Jews who are really consequential into the 80s, into the 70s, 80s, certainly, who are very important figures. And they're important, believe it or not, Welsh and Greek figures who are every bit as central to organized crime in Chicago. But because we see Al Capone and everything, because we see Lucky Luciano and everything, it's harder to recognize that there are subsequent generations.
One of the areas where Jewish, gangsters did extremely well is Las Vegas. And they really, really were the dominant figures here. When you're talking about, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel initially, Mo Dalitz, who came here from Cleveland by way of, he was in Detroit and then Cleveland and then here, and a number of others, all the way up into the 70s, even with Lucky Rosenthal out of Chicago. So what are your thoughts, Bob, on Las Vegas? And that, I almost feel like that was sort of the sort of final, the final goal for organized crime.
Well, Benjamin Siegel, I don't want to say Bugsy, hated the name. I mean, his spirit may be floating around in my study here, so I better be nice. I'll call him Ben Siegel. Yeah, he went out it was open territory. And he moved from California there. And originally he was sent by the mob, the organized mob. They sent him to California. Then he moved into Las Vegas and organized things there. I mean, not just that, prostitution and narcotics and all kinds of other things. Well, we know how he ended up. I mean, he got involved with this Virginia Hill, and they weren't sure if she was taking money from him to put in Swiss banks or everything, and he ended up being killed. The mob, they had a meeting. As I best understand it, for some people who are very close to it, he said, "What are we going to do about Ben?" I mean, they didn't call him Bugsy. He hated the name, and I mean, it just, the Bugsy means in American English, crazy as well. I mean, aside from Bugsy. And what are we going to do about it? Because the problem was, as Meyer Lansky said to me more than once, you don't want to draw attention to yourself. If you draw attention to yourself, you will be investigated in some way, either by the local government or the federal government. You don't want to do it. And the problem with Ben Siegel was he was loud and flashy and all these beautiful girlfriends and the clothing and everything else. And he wasn't quiet. I mean, he talked a lot and gave interviews. He was in the newspaper all the time. And this was bad for business. They talked about it as bad for business. It was all about business. We can't have anybody who's going to ruin our business. And they were making lots of money. So they had to eliminate him, and he was eliminated. They killed him. I mean, that's one way of eliminating competition or eliminating the problem. And so the men that I spoke to, including Meyer Lansky said to me, "Look, I never killed anybody. I was only involved in gambling." He said that to my face. And in my head, I'm thinking, yeah, but everybody around you was killing people. How do you do that? How do you justify that?
Yeah. One quick note, we had a question about, did Bugsy Siegel offer to go to Germany to kill Hitler?
Yes, not Hitler. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
The answer, I think, is that he very much wanted to go to Italy to kill Mussolini.
Kill Mussolini, right.
He had an
Look, you should know. I mean, your listeners should know. He always carried a pistol with him, in his belt or whatever. They were armed all the time. They didn't walk around unarmed. And yeah, he wanted to go. And they said, listen, his girlfriend, Dorothy DiFrazzo, said, "You can't do that." And he thought she meant you can't because it's difficult. And he meant, no, you just can't go to another country and kill one of the leaders of the country and not have any impact. So he misunderstood it, or she misunderstood him, but he never did, but he wanted to. And he wanted to kill the son of a bitches. That's what he said. I want to kill the son of a bitch. He wasn't afraid. He was a tough guy. A few people said that. Joe Stacher and other people involved with the Jewish mafia, they said the first one through the door, it was Ben Siegel, the first one with the violence, and he enjoyed the violence. I mean, he enjoyed. And there's another side to him where, if I can tell the story quickly, that there was an emissary from Palestine, the Jewish community. And I interviewed this man. He's a terrific guy. Reuven Daphne was his name. And he got a list of people to interview in the United States to raise money and to buy weapons for Jews in Palestine who knew that they're fighting against the British and they're going to fight against the Arabs. And he met with this, Reuven Daphne met with Ben Siegel. He got a call on the phone from a man named Alan Smiley. Now, Alan Smiley, and I interviewed his daughter, but because he was already deceased, but he was the right-hand man of Benjamin Siegel, Bugsy Siegel. And this man gets the call from him and says, "My boss wants to meet you." So he says, if it's to help, the Jews in Palestine, the community. Yeah, of course. So they meet in a restaurant, and I looked it up. There was that restaurant. It was the LaRue restaurant on La Cienega. I mean, when people tell me stories as a historian, I have to check it to see if it's true or not, or it's made up. Yes, there was a LaRue restaurant in La Cienega. And he gets a call to meet this person at this restaurant. And Ben Siegel, first of all, he says, I'm sitting at the table in the back room, and a couple of tough looking guys come in and examine everything. They look everywhere, like they're looking for microphones or whatever. He says, then the door opens and Ben Siegel comes in. And I said, what did he look like? He says, he was a handsome man. He came in and he sat across the table from me. And he said, tell me why you're here. And I said, look, I'm from Israel or Palestine. And I'm in the United States to raise money and buy weapons because we're going to be fighting against the British. And then after that, the Arabs. And he said, Siegel, he told me this, and he's the one who got the money. He said, he leaned across the table, he said, till his nose was almost touching my nose. And he said to me, you mean fighting as in killing? Because Siegel liked violence. He said, yes. He said, then he leaned back and he said, okay, I'm with you. I said, so then what happened? He said, every Tuesday, I would go to this restaurant. I would go to this back room and there would be a suitcase there, a small suitcase, a bag, a container, a suitcase. And he says, and it was filled with money. So I said, well, how much money did he give me? He said, until he was killed. And Ben Siegel was killed in 1946, 47, something like that. He said he gave me over $50,000 in cash. And he said that one time he also he got a letter, this emissary got to come to someone's house at midnight. A Jewish man said, well, he says, I know why you're here. And he said, all right, come to my house at midnight. Some men are going to come in and give you some money. He said, midnight? Okay. He says, but look, if it's money for the community, the Jewish community, I'll do it. He says, at midnight, I show up. The man who got the money is still alive. He told me the story. He's now 96, 97. He says, I come to the house. It's midnight. I go in. He said, I'm sitting and waiting. He said, the door opens and the strangest group of men I've ever seen came walking in. He said, none of them had necks. It was like the head was attached to the shoulders. And they sat down and the host pounded on the table and said, okay, guys, you know why you're here. And then he just went around the room and said, Max, you're giving 5,000. Joe, you're giving 10,000. So-and-so, you're giving this. And then some of them complained, yeah, but last year I gave you 10, and they didn't take any answer. And I said, then what happened? He said, at the end of the meeting, they all came up to the table and put cash on the table. And my host put it in a big paper bag. And he thanked me very much. And it was now 1 o'clock in the morning. He said, I went outside. And he says, here I was walking around the streets at 1 o'clock in the morning with a paper bag filled with about $50,000 in cash. I was terrified that someone would rob me, but who would know about it? So you have all these things going on, and the Jewish gangsters were involved in it. I have to say, the ones that I interviewed, at least, and what I've read about some of them, they were very conscious of their Jewish identity. They were very conscious of what was going on in Europe. They all knew about Hitler, and they all knew about what was happening to the Jews there. And they were very conscious and felt that it was their obligation to do what they could to protect the Jewish community in the United States. That doesn't mean they were honorable, that they didn't steal, but they took that as part of their identity or part of their job.
Sure. Joe, I want to give you the sort of last word with today. And one of the questions we had was, did your interest in this subject develop because of your stories in your family? And can you kind of explain that?
Sure. Yeah. Actually, my interest developed because of the lack of stories in my family, which is kind of fascinating. So, I didn't know that my grandfather was a gangster until well into my 20s. My mother actually came to me. There's a brief mention in a book called The Joker is Wild, which is a biography of Joe E. Lewis, who's a big Vegas figure, Geoff. So I imagine you're familiar with him and probably even that book. It's just a quick aside in there, but he mentions the Miller brothers being shot, Davey and Maxie. And my mother I don't know, she must have opened the book or found it or whatever, but she came to me. I really already graduated from college. And she said, this is kind of confusing, but Joey, is this how my father was killed? And it turned out the paperback version, it's a strange sort of publishing history. The hardcover had it correct. No one was killed. In the paperback version, though, it's my grandfather is described as having been killed. It's a best-selling book made into a movie starring Frank Sinatra and Mitzi Gaynor. And it's just amazed me. I was able to do some very quick research and find out that's not how my grandfather died. But what was startling, and again, I am a historian, but primarily I'm a literature person. I'm interested in story. And I was fascinated at the fact that within a single generation, my grandmother was actually at the scene of this shooting that was characterized as a murder when it was not. My grandmother was there. My mother never knew the story. They forgot it. They swallowed it in the course of a single family. So I've been fascinated ever since about how we shape this legacy. Legacy, certainly in terms of a historical narrative. Often we erase it. When we do tell it, we tend to tell it in sort of spectral fashion. The Jewish gangster is always just that very phrase is resonant. He's a Jewish gangster, somehow seems different from a gangster. We don't always understand what the differences are. So for me, it's I would also note there's some really fascinating possibilities for how you write about Jewish gangsters in terms of fiction, in terms of narrative. The Italian gangster, the term I like to use is framed. I like it because, of course, it suggests that you are already found guilty. You've been framed. But in the Jewish context, there is no clear frame. We don't have a story that accounts for all of the Jewish gangsters that we know of. There are Meyer Lansky types and there are Ben Siegel types who do have a clear place in the history as narrated through the Italian perspective. But the Jewish gangster is very often invisible. We just feel him by his sort of gravitational force. And just as a quick way of pointing that out, the most famous Italian gangster movie is The Godfather. And at the heart of it rests Michael Corleone, who goes from sort of the child to becoming the center of this entire larger experience. The most famous Jewish gangster movie is Once Upon a Time in America. And the two central figures in that are both almost literally ghosts throughout their most important times. So, one has left New York and comes back only decades later to recover something. The other has remained in New York, but has faked his own death and presented himself as someone else. And so I think there's a fascinating quality to that. We don't know how to contain the figure.
On that literary note, I think one of the great, somebody needs to fix this, but I think one of the great novels would be Billy Bathgate, E.L. Doctorow, just a great Jewish, gangster novel turned into a horrifically bad movie.
Yeah. It's true.
We could redo that movie and make it better.
Yeah, same thing, and that's another character where he's invisible. Billy is a gangster. He's Dutch Schultz's successor, and yet invisible to history.
Absolutely. Well, I think that there's many more questions that we could answer, but I think, Gabriel, we're out of time. Am I right?
Yeah, I know. Thank you all again so much. We really appreciated our panelists being here with us, and we'll see you at the next programs.